I was at a dinner party in Berlin recently, surrounded by people you'd typically classify as the modern intelligentsia, academics, writers, people who pride themselves on being well-read. The conversation naturally drifted toward a complex current event, the kind with layers of historical baggage and economic nuance. One guest, a man who usually loves to quote philosophy, started speaking with absolute, unwavering certainty. He laid out a rigid, black and white moral framework, dividing the actors strictly into heroes and villains, as if he were reading from a pre-approved script rather than analyzing reality. Then, a quiet woman across the table gently pushed back. She didn't even disagree with his main point. She simply introduced a contradiction, a small yes, but, regarding the economic data that complicated his narrative. The reaction was immediate and almost visceral. The man didn't pause to weigh the new information. He didn't say, "That's an interesting angle." Instead, his face tightened. He immediately shut her down, not by refuting her facts, but by labeling her observation as problematic. To him, her desire to differentiate wasn't a sign of intelligence, it was a moral failing. The silence that followed wasn't the thoughtful silence of a salon digesting a new idea. It was a fearful, awkward silence. Everyone looked down at their plates. It struck me right then. We were sitting in the self-proclaimed land of poets and thinkers, a nation built on the legacy of Goethe, Kant, and the ability to hold conflicting ideas in one's head. Yet here, thinking, the actual messy, uncomfortable process of weighing ambiguity, had completely left the room. It had been replaced by a desperate, nervous need to signal the correct attitude. It made me wonder, when exactly did we trade our famous tradition of deep, agonizing reflection for the shallow comfort of quick, absolute judgments?
That experience is, wow, it's the perfect, almost heartbreaking illustration of the central problem we're going to be talking about.
It really felt like a microcosm of something much bigger.
It is. What you saw, that immediate shutdown of nuance, that visceral reaction to a simple yes, but, it's a textbook case of what some are calling the decline of rational and dialectical public discourse.
And it's especially jarring in that German context, right?
Yeah.
The land of poets and thinking.
Exactly. I mean, this is the intellectual tradition that gave us so much critical thought. And what's driving this is what's a mix of vast sociocultural shifts, all tangled up with our technology.
The way we communicate now.
Right. We're building a society on algorithms and social media tools that are designed to reward speed and certainty, not reflection. The entire system strengthens what we could call downloading.
Downloading, what do you mean by that?
It means passively absorbing prepackaged thought models. You're not thinking through an issue, you're just downloading the correct take that aligns with your group. And this focus on ideological purity and control, where any nuance is seen as a threat, it has some very dark and frankly frightening echoes of fascistic thinking from the past.
That's a strong comparison.
It is, but the pattern is there.
All right.
So our mission for this deep dive is really twofold. First, we need to diagnose what's causing this flight from complexity.
Yeah.
And second, and this is the hopeful part, we're going to investigate a really sophisticated cognitive framework. It's called the Dialectical Thought Form approach, or DTF.
And this is designed to fix the problem.
It's designed to give us the tools to systematically revitalize that nuanced, complex thinking for today's world. And the urgency here is it's off the charts. The quality of our thinking, our ability to tackle huge global risks, it all depends on us getting out of this trap of shallow, downloaded judgment.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at why complex, messy thought is being traded for simplistic moral posturing. When you dig into it, what are the big mechanisms driving this cognitive shift, especially when it comes to things like identity and our digital lives?
Well, the first thing to really grasp is this powerful, almost corrosive interaction between these big sociocultural shifts and the way digital media works now. And at the center of it is identity politics.
How so?
When identity becomes the most important thing in a public discussion, the goal is no longer about, analyzing the facts or finding truth. The goal shifts completely.
It becomes about what?
Validation?
Exactly. It becomes about emotional validation and signaling your allegiance to your group. And that fosters this immediate, almost knee-jerk emotional reactivity. It just completely overrides the slow, difficult, and frankly resource-intensive process of nuanced thinking that a complex event, like the one at your dinner party, actually requires.
So the feeling of being right becomes more important than the process of finding out what's right. Perfectly put. And the consequence of that is profound. What we're seeing is that speaking, the act of talking about an issue, has become completely separated from its experiential base.
What do you mean by experiential base?
I mean the genuine movements in thought That's the internal process where a person actually grapples with a concept, turns it over in their mind, questions it until they truly understand it for themselves.
Okay.
That's been replaced.
Replaced with the downloading, you mentioned.
Yes. People adopt and repeat these downloaded thought models. They're basically articulating a prepackaged narrative that feels right because it validates their identity, not because they've actually arrived at that conclusion through their own hard thinking. Their personal cognitive experience is just, it's completely bypassed.
And there's a biological claim tied to this that, honestly, I want to push back on a little. The idea that these new internet and social networking technologies might be, and I'm quoting here, causally involved in bringing about an undernourishment of the prefrontal cortex, that is a huge claim.
It is a massive claim.
I mean, are we really saying the tools we use every day are actively shrinking our capacity to think? Because if that's true, if our environment is conditioning us away from deep reflection on a biological level, how can a cognitive framework like DTF possibly reverse that?
It's a profound and deeply unsettling claim, I agree. But it speaks to how high the stakes are. Think about what the prefrontal cortex does. It's the seat of all our highest functions. Conceptual thinking, moral reasoning, personality itself.
All the stuff that makes us us.
Right. And if the stimuli we're constantly feeding our brains, the super fast pace, the little dopamine hits of likes and retweets, the lack of any need for sustained attention, if those stimuli don't exercise that area of the brain, then its capacity for complex processing will naturally diminish. It's like a muscle you stop using.
So we're just conditioning our brains for quick recognition and reaction.
Yes. Instead of sustained contradictory contemplation. Now, the expectation isn't that a framework like DTF magically rewires your brain overnight. The idea is that it provides the necessary cognitive map, the structure, to intentionally start exercising those higher functions again.
So we have to consciously work against the grain of our environment.
We have to. We have to teach people how to demand more from their brains, precisely because the culture all around us is actively demanding less and less.
So, okay, the environment shrinks the mental space, and we need a framework to expand it back out. But let's look at the foundation of thinking that we're all taught in school: formal logic. The analysis suggests that the dominance of logic is itself a core problem. Why is that? Why is our go-to tool for thinking failing us?
This is such a critical point. The core issue is that formal logical thinking, which is built on the principle of identity, requires what is fundamentally an untruth.
An untruth.
Yes, it's built on the premise that A is always A. For logic to work, for it to be clean and consistent, it has to deny the existence or the reality of what this framework calls absence, or non-A.
So it denies anything that isn't A.
It has to. Formal logic, which in this developmental model is called understanding, is brilliant at one thing, making clear distinctions. And when it runs into opposition or a conflict or a contradiction, A versus non-A, its only rule is to declare the conflict logically false and get rid of it.
It cleans up the mess.
It sweeps the messiness of reality under the rug to create purity and stability. And the flaw in that becomes obvious the second you step outside the closed system of the syllogism and look at the real world.
Because the real world is all mess.
It's all mess. It's defined by unceasing transformation, by flux, and crucially, by contradiction. The little sandbox where formal logic holds true, math, pure logic, is actually tiny compared to the vast scope of human reality. Only our thinking can be logical. Reality itself never is and never could be. It's never static, which is what logic requires.
And that's where the failure comes in, when we try to apply that static model to a dynamic world.
That's the constant surprise. When policymakers or business leaders rely only on formal logic, they create these beautiful static plans. But then the inevitable transformation hits. The non-A, the market crash, the political shift, the thing they excluded from the model, and the whole plan falls apart. Their cognitive system was built on a foundation of stasis that just doesn't exist.
That makes perfect sense. You can plan a budget based on static, logical projections, but a volatile market. The non-A immediately makes that plan obsolete because the system isn't closed.
Exactly. And this very critique, this frustration with rigid classifying thinking, is what drove the founders of what we call critical theory. The DTF framework we're discussing is heavily influenced by thinkers like Theodor Adorno.
What was Adorno's main contribution here?
Adorno was obsessed with the concept of non-identity. The fact that a concept, a word, never fully captures the totality of the thing it's describing. When you label something with a single logical concept, you're simplifying it. You're ignoring its internal contradictions, its history, all of its external relationships. You're losing the truth of it.
And Adorno's student, Jürgen Habermas, he took this idea and applied it to the whole of society, the public sphere, right?
He did. Habermas was absolutely central to diagnosing the social cost of this cognitive rigidity. He saw that the whole process of modernization was prioritizing what he called instrumental rationality, pure, cold, system logic used just to achieve efficiency. And he argued this was rigidifying public life.
How so?
Well, in his most famous work, he talks about the decay of the public sphere. He saw how this ideal space for rational, critical debate was being destroyed. Commercial mass media came in and turned a critical public into a passive, consuming public.
The opposite of active, messy thinking.
The total opposite. Deep thought and genuine deliberation were replaced by system logic and commercial needs. Or, as you saw at that dinner party, by a strict adherence to these prepackaged, downloaded narratives. Habermas's whole philosophy after that was a search for a way back, a way to restore our capacity for complex, critical reason through communication. And that's exactly the need this DTF framework tries to meet, but on a cognitive, practical level.
So, if rigid, purely instrumental logic fails us by creating this false sense of certainty and stasis, what is the alternative? What allows us to embrace the contradictions and complexity we actually see in reality? And here's where I have to play devil's advocate. Doesn't embracing all that contradiction and flux just lead to analysis paralysis? How does this messy idea of dialectical thinking actually lead to action?
That is the absolute million-dollar question, because dialectics is so often dismissed as this purely abstract ivory tower philosophy. But dialectical thinking, which is defined as the art of thinking, the coincidence of distinctions and connections, is not paralysis, it's the opposite. It's the fluidity you need for real transformation. It's the necessary first step for any effective action in a complex, open system.
So how does it achieve that fluidity?
The hard core of it, the engine, is the concept of absence, or non-A. Yeah. Unlike logic, which has to throw non-A out, dialectic actively engages with it. It looks right at the contradiction, the flaw, the thing that's missing. And that's why it's so geared toward understanding how reality works.
So it's a tool for discovery.
It's a discovery procedure, exactly. It's aimed at finding truth in a world that is constantly, unceasingly transforming. It's the key not just to seeing simple change like A becomes B, but to grasping true transformation where A becomes a fundamentally new, more complex A prime. You simply cannot guide transformation if you don't embrace the contradictions that are driving it.
You mentioned truth earlier, and you made a very specific distinction between two different kinds. Can you go back to that? Why is that difference so critical for understanding what dialectical thinking is trying to do?
Yes, this is foundational. Most of us, most of the time, operate entirely within the world of propositional truth. This is your conventional logical truth. The sun is hot. 2 + 2 = 4. The premise that a rose is a rose. It deals with facts that obey the rules of formal logic and consistency.
It's what we'd call facts in everyday language.
Pretty much. But dialectical thinking is aiming for something much deeper. It's aiming for alethic truth. And alethic truth is about truth as an aspect of reality itself. It's about the totality of an object, its whole web of relationships, including all the conditions, the history, and crucially, the absences that allow it to exist or to transform.
So it's moving from a simple statement about the thing to understanding the whole system the thing exists in.
Precisely. This requires putting dialectics on what philosophers would call an ontological foundation. It's where thought and reality become inseparable. The goal is to close that gap that so many have pointed out, that the gap between how reality actually works, which is messy and transforming, and how we habitually think, which is static and logical.
Can we use a real-world example to make this idea of alethic truth more concrete? Something beyond just a rose is a rose?
Let's use a piece of legislation. Let's call it Bill X. The propositional truth is very simple. The government passed Bill X. That's a demonstrable logical fact. You can look it up.
Okay, simple enough.
But the alethic truth of Bill X is vastly more complex. It asks, what is the full reality of Bill X, including all the non-beings it actively excludes? The alethic truth includes the social problem or the policy gap that the bill was trying to negate in the first place. That's absence number one.
The problem it's trying to solve.
Yes. It also includes the marginalized groups whose specific needs were left out or made invisible by the way the bill was written. That's absence number two. It includes the long-term environmental costs that were ignored for short-term economic gain. Absence number three. A purely logical thinker just sees the text of Bill X. A dialectical thinker sees the entire contradictory reality of which that bill is only one single momentary expression.
So to get to that deeper alethic truth, we have to formally bring what we normally think of as not there into our definition of reality. What does this category of absence actually include?
Absence or non-A, is everything that is undeniably real but isn't materially there in a positive sense. So this includes things like losses, omissions, empty spaces, social ills, lies, illness, death. Even critique itself is a form of absence. It's pointing to what is not right.
Things we all know are real, but that logic struggles to categorize.
Exactly. And the sources are clear that these aren't just minor details, they are fundamental components of existence. You can't use logic to think away the reality of a social injustice or a lie or a personal loss. Logic just shoves these non-beings into the category of non-A and labels them false or negative. Dialectical thinking looks at them head-on as structural parts of reality that are actively driving transformation.
Okay, and this brings us to the core mechanism that's supposed to prevent that analysis paralysis I mentioned, the thing that ensures action. It's called preservative negation. What is that, and how does it help us use non-A constructively?
Preservative negation is the absolute key to overcoming that paralysis. The big stumbling block for formal logic is that it can't handle transformation because it has to eliminate the negative, the contradiction.
It throws it out.
It throws it out.
Yeah.
But real transformation requires moving from A to non-A, the critique, the flaw, and then using that to get to A prime, the transformed version. Preservative negation means that the negative, what's wrong, what's absent, what's false about the current state, is preserved in your mind. It's held onto as a vital active element that flows into the new synthesis, the A prime.
Can you give me an analogy for that?
Think about product design. To improve a product, which is A, you have to start by acknowledging its flaws and failures, which is non-A. Formal logic, if you applied it strictly, would just say the flawed product is simply not A, and you discard the critique.
You just say, well, that's not what we were trying to build.
Right. But dialectical thinking insists that the specific, preserved details of the flaw, the negation, are the most important information you have. That information is what drives the invention of the successful new product, a prime. Without enduring the reality of absence, the change, the disillusionment, the critique, no living system, whether it's cognitive or a company or a person, can achieve its transformed identity. The conflict isn't discarded, it's integrated as fuel for growth.
So the negative becomes the engine of positive change.
That's the essence of it. And since reality is this constant transformation driven by these internal contradictions, the Dialectical Thought Form framework gives us a way to make sense of it. It uses 4 specific conceptual lenses, or moments, which we call CPRT.
CPRT. What does that stand for?
It stands for context, process, relationship, and transformation. I should note you might see it called LA in some of the older texts, but CPRT is more descriptive. And these 4 are not, linear steps like a recipe. They're 4 classes of thought forms that unfold in our thinking all the time, in a kind of rhythm, always flowing between each other.
Okay, let's break down these 4 moments. And what I think is really useful is to talk about the specific fallacies, the specific mistakes we make when we ignore one of these lenses.
Absolutely. So first up is context C. This lens focuses on the real world's complexity and what's called its stratification. The idea that reality exists in layers, the virtual, the actual, the real, and it's structured by these deep mechanisms that are not always under our control. This perspective is vital for just mapping the static structures of a situation.
And what's the mistake we make if we ignore context?
The error is called de-stratification. This is the fallacy of making the world seem centric and flat. A thinker who does this sees only one obvious layer of reality. For example, they might look at a complex social problem like poverty and see it only through the lens of individual choice.
People should just work harder.
Exactly. They are completely ignoring the other layers, the strata, the systemic issues, the historical context, the economic structures that shape and constrain that individual choice. They've flattened a multi-layered problem into a single simplistic one.
Okay, so that's context. What's next?
Second is process P. This moment is all about absence. It's defined by negativity, contradiction, and unremitting change. This lens forces us to see the constant flow and flux in any system. Nothing is ever truly static.
And the fallacy here.
The primary fallacy is positivization. This is basically the denial of absences. It's insisting on painting the world as purely positive or perfectly harmonious when it isn't. The classic example is a corporate leader who sees high quarterly earnings and declares everything is perfect.
While ignoring all the warning signs.
Right. They're ignoring the internal structural flaws, the rising debt, the critical employee feedback. They're actively excluding all the negative process indicators because they've committed to a positive-only view of reality.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the third moment?
Third is relationship. This is the lens that views reality as the totality of strongly interconnected and often incompatible components. It emphasizes holistic causality, the idea that everything is intrinsically related.
And the error here is pretty obvious, I guess.
It's detotalization. And we see this everywhere. It's neglecting those interrelationships and seeing the world as just a fragmented collection of independent parts. It's siloed thinking.
Can you give an example?
Sure, a policymaker might design what they think is a perfect healthcare system in a vacuum, but they've committed detotalization because they failed to consider how its funding is intrinsically related to and limited by the education system, the tax code, and public infrastructure. They're treating the parts like isolated machines instead of components of one single interdependent social organism.
Right. And the fourth moment, the T in CPRT.
Fourth, and this is the most critical one for action, is transformation.
What?
This is about the unceasing transformation of systems, and crucially for us, it's where our intentional causality comes in. This is the moment that offers the leverage points for us to actually practice transformation and actively negate social problems.
So this is where human agency comes into play.
Precisely. And the major fallacy here is de-agentification. This is the denial of human agency. It often shows up as fatalism. The system is too complex, the problem is too big, there's nothing we can do. This mindset just rejects the entire premise that humans can shape their own reality in cooperation with the natural necessity of change.
That's an incredibly useful breakdown because it gives us a diagnostic toolkit for bad thinking. If someone is only using, say, context and process, they might see a complex system that's always in motion, but they completely miss the internal connections or their own power to change it.
And that gets us to the most crucial cognitive demand of this whole framework: coordination. The human mind simply cannot comprehend a complex transformation by focusing on just one of these moments. You only grasp reality in its fullness when you coordinate all 4 CPRT simultaneously.
And there's a specific term for what happens if you don't do that, right?
Yes. The systems designers call it the snakebite of dialectic. The idea is that dialectical thinking is a circular system. All the CPRT perspectives intrinsically depend on each other. If you try to isolate just one, you inevitably commit the fallacy associated with it, and that isolated perspective poisons your understanding of all the others.
So they're only meaningful together.
They're mere abstractions in isolation. Context without post. Process is just a flat, dead photograph. Process without relationship is just random, meaningless chaos. You have to hold them all in your mind at the same time.
Let's use a complex, real-world system to illustrate this. Not a beehive, but something like, well, like the city where I had that dinner party. How does the CPRT lens help us understand the reality of a city like Berlin in a way that formal logic just can't?
That's a great example. Okay, so if we look at Berlin using only the context C lens, what do we see? We see the static structures, the buildings, the districts, the official population data, the U-Bahn grid. This is all essential information, but on its own, it's very shallow. It's a map, not the city.
Just the facts.
Just the facts. Now let's add the process P lens. Suddenly we see that the city is pervaded by absences. We see rapid gentrification that's displacing longtime residents. That's a critical negation. We see the historical trauma of the wall, which still casts a psychological shadow, the past actively influencing the present. We see the constant flux of economic cycles. A purely logical thinker struggles to integrate these non-beings into their official definition of the city.
They're hard to quantify.
Exactly. Now let's add the relationship labs. This reveals the totalizing web of intrinsic connections. We start to see how the affordability of housing in one district is inextricably linked to the success of the tech startup scene in another, or how a municipal policy failure in transport is connected to federal funding structures. The city isn't just a collection of adjacent districts, it's an organic, interdependent totality.
And finally, transformation.
Finally, we integrate the transformation T-lens. This is what lets us use all that complex data to identify points of leverage, our intentional causality. We don't just describe the process of gentrification. We can now identify specific policy interventions that could transform the outcome. And we do that by leveraging our understanding of the political context and the intrinsic housing market relationships.
So coordinating all 4 moves you from just describing the city to actually being able to change it intelligently.
That's the leap. It moves you from mere description to critical realism and ultimately to transformative practice. You're seeing the structures, the flux, the connections, and the potential for agency all at once.
And this also clarifies the difference you mentioned between critical and constructive thinking within this framework.
It does. Critical thinking in this model is primarily focused on process P and relationship.
Yeah.
It's using the lens of unceasing change and systemic connections to radically question the givens. It asks, how did this come to be? And what does its existence depend on excluding?
So it's the deconstruction phase.
Exactly. In contrast, constructive thinking focuses on context, C, the existing structures, and transformation, T, the potential for future systems. It uses the insights from the critique to design and build the A prime. Both modes are essential. Critique lays bare the absences, and construction builds the new reality by integrating that negation.
Hey, this is where it gets really interesting for me, because what you're saying is that thinking this way dialectically isn't just a switch you flip. It's the result of development that continues long after we leave school. The sources suggest this is a capability that matures potentially between the ages of 25 and 100.
That's right. It's very much an adult cognitive achievement. It's something that's reached through, intentional effort and often through life experience itself. And this development follows what's called the UDR movement. It starts with understanding, which is formal logic. Then it moves through dialectic, the messy middle. And hopefully it arrives at reason, which then can lead to practical wisdom. And I have to stress, this is not some clean linear upgrade. It's a messy circular journey. You can be thinking at the level of reason one day, and then under stress, you regress right back to the simple comfort of formal logic.
I want to dig into that transition from dialectic to reason. What does it mean to experience, as the sources say, absence and disillusionment the hard way? That sounds less like a cognitive stage and more like hard-won maturity.
It is absolutely about maturity. The journey begins with understanding. That's mastering formal logic, learning how to make clear distinctions. It's what our school system is designed to teach us. Then when we enter the real world, we're forced into the dialectic process where we have to confront the fact that reality doesn't obey our clean, logical rules.
Life gets messy.
Life gets very messy. And the transition to reason is the moment when your understanding has been shattered by that messiness repeatedly. It's when you finally realize that your perfectly logical plan failed. Not because you were unlucky, but because you willfully excluded a negative reality, a contradiction you didn't want to see, a political flaw, a human irrationality.
So reason is what's left after your certainty has been broken.
It's the recognition that certainty is an illusion and complexity is the default state of the world. And you can't get there just by reading a book on dialectics. You have to actually experience the hard truth of non-A. The project that fails, the loss, the systemic failure, and you have to preserve that painful negation in your cognitive system. Reason is complex thinking that has been tested, beaten up, and transformed by reality.
And practical wisdom.
That's the final era. It's where reason becomes effortless, deeply integrated, a new kind of second nature. It's only at that level that the risk of regressing back to that simplistic, comforting, logical thinking is truly overcome.
This sounds like it must be tied to psychological growth models, especially the way we define ourselves. The sources call this the social-emotional stance.
It's precisely tied to that. In this constructive developmental framework, the act of making an experience is a feedback loop, and it's based on two interactive parts. First, the cognitive tools we've been talking about, logical or dialectical thinking, and second, your social-emotional stance.
What exactly is a stance?
It's your level of meaning-making. It's how you define yourself in relation to the world around you. And these two components, your tools and your stance, are locked in a feedback loop. Your stance dictates which tools you're capable of using, and the tools you have available to you define the kind of experience you can even have.
We should probably clarify the developmental stages you're referring to here from someone like Robert Keegan. How does a person's stance from being defined by others to defining the whole system? How does that change their experience of the world?
It fundamentally changes everything. Let's take Keegan's stages. If a person is at stage 3, the socialized mind, they define themselves entirely by the expectations of their external group, their family, their culture, their political tribe. Their sense of self is embedded in what others expect of them, so their world feels totally dependent on those external anchors.
I can't see the system they're in.
They are the system they're in. Yeah. But when they move to stage 4, the self-authoring mind, they develop their own internal compass, their own system of values. They become a self-sufficient subject, and the world becomes this larger, objective thing that they can navigate and manage.
And stage 5?
At stage 5, the self-transforming mind, the individual realizes that even their own internal system isn't absolute. They see the world as this complex, contradictory totality of which they're just one small, constantly evolving part. The world itself literally seems to change based on the maturity of the stance that's experiencing it. And that stance is what dictates whether you're even capable of picking up and using these complex dialectical tools.
This link between personal maturity and cognitive capacity brings us right back to Habermas. He was always emphasizing that reason has to be realized through what he called communicative competence.
The alignment there is crucial. Habermas was looking for the social conditions that would be necessary for the kind of rational, critical communication that could overcome system logic and ideology. He even defined what he called the ideal speech situation.
What did that entail?
It was a situation where all the participants had equal capacities for discourse, total social equality, and where their words weren't being distorted by ideology or power dynamics. And that, of course, demands tremendous cognitive maturity from everyone involved.
It sounds like an ideal that's almost impossible to reach.
It is, but DTF provides the very tool set that Habermas's theory needs to become practical. It defines dialectic as deep thinking in real time. The whole goal of a dialogue becomes discovering your own movements in thought in exchange with others. True communicative competence requires the ability to articulate complexity, to accept critique, that's preservative negation, and to connect seemingly disparate concepts, all skills that are explicitly developed by mastering these dialectical thought forms. So the big question then is, how do we get these abstract moments of CPRT into a form that's measurable and usable in the real world? And the DTF framework does this through 28 specific thought forms, or TFs. There are 7 for each of the CPRT classes.
And these thought forms, they're like the building blocks of thinking.
You can think of them that way. They are the visible linguistic evidence of the invisible thinking ego. They are the specific patterns in someone's speech that we can actually listen for and measure.
Could you give us a few concrete examples? What do these thought forms actually sound like across the 4 classes? This feels like where the theory becomes a practical tool.
Absolutely. Think of TFs as specific ways a thinker frames reality in their speech. So for context, see, the TFs are all about static structure and classification. So you'll hear things like classification grouping, or boundary setting, defining what's inside and what's outside a system. It's very descriptive.
Okay, and for process?
For process P, the TFs are focused on change and absence. So the key ones here are critique identifying flaws or contradictions, and contradiction, where someone explicitly states that 2 incompatible truths are coexisting.
So that's the yes, but from the dinner party.
That is a perfect example of a contradiction TF. Then for relationship, the TFs are all about totalities and connections. So you'll hear holistic causality, which is explaining how everything affects everything else, or internal relationality, which is defining that essential, non-negotiable connection between 2 elements.
And finally, transformation.
For transformation, T, the TFs are about agency and systemic shifts. So you'll hear systemic shift, which is explaining how a whole system changes its fundamental nature, and intentional causality, which is defining how a specific human action can consciously alter the course of that system.
That makes the measurement process so much clearer. You're literally tracking how often someone uses these different forms of speech, but just counting them isn't enough, right? Quantity isn't the same as depth.
Yeah.
How do you measure deep thinking versus just shallowly mentioning a concept?
That's a critical distinction. We measure depth using what's called the PEL sequence: pointing, elaborating, and linking. It's very simple. Merely pointing to a concept like saying, there's a contradiction in this policy. That's very shallow.
That's just naming it.
Right. Elaborating on that point adds some depth. But true, measurable depth only comes from linking that thought form to others, especially to TF and the other CPRT classes. When you do that, you create a cluster, which is called a constellation.
A constellation of thought forms.
Yes. And this is where Adorno's idea of non-identity becomes a fully operational tool. A concept, or a TF, means very little in isolation. It's only when you assemble them into these constellations that a complex thought object starts to yield its secrets. A logical classifying procedure might only use context TFs to define an object, completely ignoring its non-identity. A dialectical constellation, on the other hand, captures the object's structures, C, its flaws, P, its connections, R, and its potential for change. T, the constellation is what reveals the actual contradictory complex truth.
Let's go back to the example of the circular economy to see how this plays out. What's the practical difference between a logical thinker's constellation and a dialectical one's?
Okay, so let's imagine thinker A, who's a dominantly logical thinker. We run an analysis of their speech. We generate what's called a cognitive behavior graph, or CBG, and it shows that maybe 65% of their thought forms are stuck in the context C class, and maybe they have 0% in transformation T.
So they're just describing.
They see the circular economy as an abstract, static design, a system of classifications and resource management. But because they're committing the fallacies of de-stratification and de-agentification, they're completely unable to appreciate the complexity. They fail to see the internal conflicts, waste, which is an absence, and social inequalities are the very things that are driving the necessary reshaping of the system.
And thinker B, the dialectical thinker.
Figure B's graph shows a balanced coordination across all of CPRT. They've let go of the dominance of pure logic. So they appreciate the economy's inherent complexity, but they also recognize the risks for instability and resource depletion. They see the intrinsic reliance of all the elements on one another are, and critically, they can identify the policy entry points for intentional reshaping T. That structural depth means they are prepared for the flux. They aren't paralyzed by it.
This pragmatic side of it suggests DTF is really powerful for organizations, not just for academic debate. How is it actually applied in real-world settings, like coaching or policy design?
It's absolutely designed to be pragmatic. The whole point is to get dialectical thinking off its philosophical pedestal and turn it into a tool for intervention.
So how does it work in coaching?
In cognitive coaching and talent management, it's used to solve a very specific organizational problem. What happens when an individual is in over their head? When the complexity of their role, the size of role, is greater than their current developmental capability, the size of person.
And how do you diagnose that?
By analyzing the thought forms they use when they describe their challenges.
Yeah.
The coach generates that CBG, that cognitive graph, and it maps exactly which of the CPRT moments are missing. It shows precisely where the thinker is committing fallacies.
And how do you get them talking in a way that reveals that?
The coach will use a structured interview framework, like the 3 houses of work. They get the individual to talk about their task, what they do day to day, their organizational context, the system they work within, and their own role and identity in that system. This structure naturally prompts the speaker to use TFs from all these different dimensions, which allows the coach to spot the missing links and then guide them toward a more coordinated, complex perspective.
And what about for big, complex policy areas like planning for sustainability or climate change?
It's the same principle. When planners are designing complex policy, like moving a whole economy toward a circular model, if they rely only on formal logic models, they're assuming stasis and predictability. They're committing positivization by ignoring waste streams, the non-A, and they're committing detotalization by ignoring the complex interrelationships between consumer behavior, regulation, and manufacturing.
So DTF acts as a corrective.
It's an essential corrective. By applying the 4 moments, it forces planners to anticipate natural transformations. P. To acknowledge the non-beings, like hidden environmental costs, and to structure the policy around human agency and intentionality. T. It forces them to reject the neat, closed, algorithmic system of predictable outcomes and instead engage with the messy, open, transforming world as it actually is.
So we started this whole deep dive with that observation at the dinner party, that messy, authentic thinking has been replaced by this nervous need to signal the correct attitude, prioritizing certainty over reflection. If DTF gives us the cognitive roadmap, how do we actually shift the culture back toward authentic, complex engagement?
The shift, I think, has to start with education. The primary goal has to be fostering a pedagogy of dialectical thinking in our schools and universities, and starting at the earliest possible age. We have to intentionally build these cognitive muscles before the dominance of purely logical and algorithmic thinking completely snuffs out the resources for holistic thought.
So you're talking about teaching thinking itself.
Exactly. Teaching DTF as meta-thinking. Teaching students how to analyze the structure of their own thinking and the thinking of others. It starts by making them intensely aware of the built-in limitations of pure logical thinking. And then you give them the framework to see how reality is constructed differently when we use different conceptual tools. This is a core part of developing the civic virtues we need for any kind of nuanced public debate. It's a direct antidote to that simplistic moral posturing.
And what about applying this in group dynamics, like in a boardroom or a political committee or a public forum, where this culturally predetermined thinking is often reinforced by peer pressure?
That's where DTF consultation becomes incredibly transformative. In a group setting where a certain way of thinking is the default, the facilitator's role is to lay bare the thought form structure of the conversation for everyone to see.
How do they do that?
The whole process is about pointing to the absences in the group's initial problem formulation. The facilitator uses the 4 moments of dialectic to identify precisely where the group, as a whole, is committing fallacies.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say a committee is stuck in positivization, that fallacy from the process moment. They're only talking about the good news, the success metrics. The facilitator who is using dialectical listening can intervene with a question that forces them into a different moment.
A question that introduces negativity.
Exactly. Something like, okay, we're talking about all the success metrics, which is great, but what hidden contradiction within our organizational structure is actively working to undermine those numbers? And how is that specific contradiction linked to our core mission? See, that question forces them to use a critique TF from the process moment and an internal relationality TF from the relationship moment.
It breaks them out of their rut.
It breaks them out of the rut. And the really powerful outcome is often not that they find a perfect solution. It's the realization that their initial truth about the situation was nothing more than a presentation problem. It was just one limited, logically constrained way of constructing reality. And that realization forces the dialogue back to a much more fundamental place, the creation of a truthful reality, not just the description of a limited one.
You mentioned that the royal road to becoming a dialectical thinker isn't just self-analysis, it's engaging with others. What is that path dialectical listening, and what does it actually look like in a conversation?
Dialectical listening is really the highest skill in this entire framework. It's the ability to recognize the thought forms in another person's speech flow in real time. You're not just hearing the content of what they're saying, you're actively monitoring the cognitive structure of their argument.
So you're listening to how they're thinking.
You're listening to how they're thinking. For example, if the person you're talking to is constantly using context TFs, classifying things, setting boundaries, describing static structures, you know immediately they're stuck in the C moment.
Yeah.
And they're almost certainly committing the fallacy of de-stratification.
And once you know that, what do you do?
Dialectical listening allows you to get ahead of the speaker. You can anticipate the structural flaw in their thinking, and then you can gently challenge them to consider the missing elements. If they're stuck in context, you ask them a process-based question.
Like what?
Something like, thank you for defining the system so clearly. Now, can we look at that system not just as it is today, but as it is becoming? What specific part of its past is actively influencing its future, and what inherent contradictions are driving its necessary decay? That kind of question forces them out of their logical adherence to stasis and pushes them toward complexity.
That sounds like a tremendously generous and rigorous way to have a conversation. You're not trying to win an argument, you're trying to unlock the other person's deeper potential for thought.
That is the entire goal. The highest compliment an interlocutor can receive after a dialectical session is for the other person to say, thank you. You've made me think about my topic in a way I've never done before or even knew that I could.
That's powerful.
It shows that the ultimate purpose of this has been achieved. It's unlocked the potential complexity in both the person and in the reality they're perceiving. It moves the entire discourse past that nervous, shallow need for the correct signaling that you saw in Berlin, and it brings us back to what thinking should be. Genuine, hard-won, and messy.
We started with the paralyzing silence of a dinner party, witnessing the intellectual stifling caused by absolute judgment and this desperate craving for certainty. And throughout this, we found a cognitive path back toward complexity, one that's structured around the uncomfortable but absolutely necessary truth of absence. We've learned that true thinking is not confined to the formal logic we're all taught in school. It's an expansive developmental journey, that UDR movement, and it demands that we embrace contradictions and coordinate multiple perspectives all at once. This framework for deep thought DTF, which is rooted in these long traditions of critical theory and critical realism, it isn't just some philosophical curiosity. It's an urgent tool for cultural self-correction and a practical guide for collaborative intelligence, equipping us to move beyond superficial agreement and to engage truthfully with the unceasing transformations of the real world.
And that coordinated ability to see reality through all four moments of context, process, relationship, and transformation. That is the capacity to think at the level of living systems. It lets us move as close as we possibly can to critical realism in how we understand the world. It means consciously rejecting the neat, closed system of predictable algorithms and certain outcomes in favor of that messy, contradictory, yet ultimately more truthful engagement with complexity that defines genuine reason. The goal at the end of the day is to elevate our thinking so that we are no longer surprised by reality.